Hello and welcome. I'm Yamini, joined by Paul Vorback from Academy Global. Today, we're comparing financial management in the public and private sectors. How different are they really, and what does that mean for finance professionals moving between them? So, Paul, let's start from here. When finance professionals move between private and public sectors, what tends to surprise them the most, and where do the two genuinely line up?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because through the work that we do at Academy Global, we see a lot of people moving from private sector and taking up roles in public sector finance areas. And I think that from my observations, the differences on the technical side aren't as great as what people anticipate. And I'll explain what I mean by the technical side in a second. But where they're often most surprised is on the non-technical, so maybe the cultural differences between public sector finance versus private sector finance. So if I start with what we mean by the technical differences, that really stems from the nature of the accounting standards. Now, we're fortunate across Australia because the public sector across Australian levels of government, local government, state and Commonwealth government, have adopted what we call the international accounting standards. And so the local accounting body called the Australian Accounting Standards Board has essentially looked to harmonise international standards for public sector context. And that's a huge benefit. And it doesn't exist everywhere around the world. Once upon a time, even in Australia, they were quite different. The way of reporting was different. Some of the terminology was different. So technically, we're very fortunate that apart from a couple of key exceptions, generally speaking, anybody who was trained in a business school, did an accounting qualification, will find the vast majority of the logic of how to account for financial transactions, how to record and how to report will be much the same. Probably the biggest difference, Yamini, is where people don't understand that the traditional things you learn in a private sector environment, such as trying to maximize a profit, trying to reduce costs at all, to all extents you possibly can, looking at finance as a source of competitive advantage against your opposition in the market. Those don't apply really at all when you look at finance through a public lens. So in the public sector, the accounting and finance is very much around maximising the services which the government organisation can provide to the public. So if money's been allocated to solve problems across health, education, defence, across the justice and corrections aspects of our communities, then the expectation is that that money will be spent well. And the term value for money is a very important term within the public sector, has some particular meanings and expectations for executives. But there's no benefit, there's no reward for creating a gap between what you receive in your funding and what you spend in terms of your funding. And in many respects, there's almost a seemingly perverse expectation that you'll spend everything that you're allocated. And if you don't spend everything which you're allocated, it will be difficult, not impossible, but it'll be difficult to make convincing claims for the same amount of money or more money in subsequent periods. So as a result of this difference, some public sector organisations in some jurisdictions, most notably within New South Wales, take the income statement and they change it fundamentally to present, instead of the usual presentation, which is revenue less expenses equals profit, it looks at what are those activities that we need to deliver for the benefit of the community. So they are usually the expenses. So we list all of those down, and then we bring in the allocation that's come from Treasury into the income line or the revenue line, and then we look at whether we have a surplus, so additional funds remaining, or if we have a deficit. So at a technical level, the similarities are much greater than what many people suspect. The real differences, I guess, are around thinking about the role of public sector finance in underpinning service delivery and not looking for profits to reward what are ostensibly private shareholders. Those shareholders might exist in a listed company where they're buying shares on the exchange, or they could even be investors in private companies. In the commercial and corporate area, the focus on finance is to amplify the gap between whatever you generate, your income, against your expenses. So that difference in objective flows through and affects the philosophy of how finance and accounting operates in public sector environments.
Right. So coming to my next question, actually, what actually makes public sector finance different, and what constraints does that create?
So in the private sector, as a contrast, there are opportunities for bonuses, there are opportunities for commissions. Some senior executives in some public sector agencies and enterprises can be subject to bonuses and incentives, but generally speaking, that's uncommon as a basic premise for public sector finance staff. So again, it goes back to the objectives. In the private sector, there is a logic behind rewarding through bonuses managers and executives who can amplify the gap between revenue and expense. So the logic would be, well, why not provide an opportunity for people to share in that if they've driven through effective decisions, probably made some difficult decisions as well, to why not give them a share of that bonus pool? So that means that we've got a different system of incentives, and incentives have been proven to make a big difference in the way in which people make decisions. So a criticism that you'll commonly hear from private sector in relation to their public sector counterparts in finance is they'll say, oh, look, they're not driving really hard to keep costs down. They're not really driving hard to make innovation that will drive improvements in efficiencies. And part of the explanation for that is it makes no difference to the staff, certainly in the shorter run, whether they make those decisions or not. So there's a whole range around incentives and behaviours and how you can influence people in their decision making. And that extends right through to risk as well. So again, in a commercial competitive environment, it's recognised that finance has to provide the resources for organisations to typically apply those resources to compete against other organisations. So finance and risk are very clearly articulated and understood in high-performing commercial firms. That can lead to a different set of disciplines and probably expertise that you might not see is developed to quite the same extent in a public sector environment.
Right. So now, does that different purpose change how each sector defines success and manages what it owns? And where is the finance role itself heading?
Yes, it does affect decision making. It does affect the nature of executive appointments and their remuneration and the opportunity that they may have to participate in upside. And upside again in private sector environments, that's a mathematical equation which is quite easy to objectively evaluate. Now, of course, in a public sector environment, outside of principles like value for money, ensuring there's strong control postures around compliance, which is not unique, by the way, to public sector, but because of the importance of reputation and the transparency of decision making in public sector environments, there's probably a greater focus on compliance and probity in the public finance space than quite what you see in the private sector environment. So the skill sets are largely transferable at the basic technical level. However, you'll find that on the margins, the types of skills and insights and experience that matter at the most senior levels can differ more greatly. So all senior finance people need to be comfortable with influencing, negotiating those individuals or organisations that are responsible for providing funding. So that's quite a transferable skill, but it's quite a different nature of communication influencing between public and private. So for heads of departments and agencies in a public sector environment, they'll be looking to influence ministers in the government. They'll be looking to influence the departments of Treasury, and they'll be looking to build internal cases around receiving more funding to not only meet the baseline service provision, but also to enhance the political electability of the government of the day as well. So inherently you see a political element that's not present in the same way in a commercial environment. In the commercial environment, depending upon the funding structure of the firm, that will dictate the nature of conversations and opportunities to influence those who provide financial resources. So, for example, in companies which are listed on the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX, you'll find that senior finance roles, chief financial officers, will need to be quite sophisticated in developing their marketing messages to the broader public, to the financial press, like the Australian Financial Review, like Bloomberg, like other finance intermediaries and media organisations. For privately held firms, the pathway to capital is different. It might be with existing owners, it might be with private equity firms, it could be with investment banks. So what drives the differences in terms of the influencing skills, the communication skills between public finance leaders and private sector finance can really be seen in terms of where the sources of those funds ultimately come from.
And Paul, coming to my final question, for anyone wanting to build that blend of skills, where should they start?
So because our universities train future accountants and finance staff largely through the lens of private sector, the practical challenge is much more frequently engaging talented people who are currently in the private sector and seeking to provide them with opportunities for interesting and exciting finance and accounting roles in the public sector. So I think the first message is that not only has your technical training served you really well, particularly in the Australian landscape for the reasons that we just discussed earlier, that the similarities in the accounting standards are very, very high. But any gaps and differences that do exist are quite easy to navigate. So if somebody had worked in an accounting firm or worked in a small firm, a commercial firm in a finance or accounting role, they won't find the transferring into public environment difficult in terms of the language, the core accounting and finance skills that they've developed will work well. Where the difference tends to lie and where the challenges tend to lie is probably more cultural. It's about thinking about the role of financial resources is to support the delivery of services to the community. And it's about thinking about how I can best influence and shape that responsibly going forward. Now, for many people who are used to working in private sector finance, they find the for-purpose opportunities in public finance to be far more encouraging, far more inspiring, and often provide them with a much greater sense of purpose. I think the nature of finance roles in commercial firms, not all, but a number, can lead to finance staff over time feeling like their purpose is really just to generate increasing private wealth for some quite privileged individuals. In the public sector environment, you can see where your work can have an impact, how improvements in transport, quality of education, healthcare can all be influenced through excellence in public sector finance and accounting. It's a lot harder to see those lines drawn in commercial finance and accounting roles.
Well, that's a fascinating look at how much, the two sectors share and where they part ways. So thank you so much, Paul, for explaining that all to us. And thank you all for joining and watching.